Okay, so today's lesson is solve an equation with squares. You're going to have 3 steps that you're going to need to follow in order to solve equation with square roots. Now, the first step, box the square root. Then you're going to use the golden rule to get the square root by itself. Put a box around the word box, so that's a visual reminder that you are going to put a box around the square root. So you're going to start with multi-steps here. So as soon as you see the equation, instead of just circling the variable and drawing the line of equality, you're also going to box the square root. That's going to be so important for you guys to do because that's going to be a visual reminder of you have to get that square root by itself before you can determine what the variable is going to be. Now, what's the inverse operation for square root? How do I get rid of a square root? What's the opposite of square root?
Root square.
Kind of close. You said part of the word. If I say, if I say I want to get rid of this square sign, the square root sign, how do I get rid of the square root sign? What cancels out a square root sign? You guys did this second triad. Yeah, a little square. So the square and square root cancel. So your second step here, to get rid of the square root, you're going to square both sides of the equation. Because remember the golden rule. Whatever you do to one side of the line of equality, you must do to the other. Then the final step is to solve as usual. So go ahead and take a second to get that down. So 3 steps. Solving an equation with square roots, you're going to have 3 steps you're going to follow. So example number 1 here. When you are solving equations, one of the most important things is make sure you put that square root over only what's being square rooted, I guess. So for example, you have the square root of c plus 2 equals 5. You want to make sure that square root sign ends right after that 2. You do not want to extend it further than that. So we're going to follow the steps that we just talked about. As always, anytime we see a variable, we're going to circle our variable. Then we're going to draw our line of equality. Now this is where the new stuff comes in. The first step says, box the square root. So I'm going to put a box around the square root, nothing else. Now our goal is to get this square root by itself. You can determine that if it's by itself or not by looking. Is there anything outside of the box? No. In this particular example, there's nothing else there. So we can go ahead and move down to step 2 because the square root is by itself. Step 2, we want to get rid of the square root. In order to get rid of the square root, we square each side of the equation. So go ahead and square each side of the equation. Because whatever you do to one side of the line of equality, you must do to the other. Thank you.
Are we ever going to use this type of math?
So the square and square root on my left side then cancel. If the square and square root cancel on my left side here, there is no longer a square root over this. So I can just bring down the c plus 2. Now on my right side, 5 squared. You have to simplify that. So what's 5 squared? Now remember, it's not 5 times 2. It's 5 times itself 2 times. So 5 times 5. That's 25. And now you're step 3. Solve as usual. So here you just have a one-step equation. So you would solve as you normally would. So how do we get the c by itself?
Minus 2.
So c equals,
23.
and box your answer. Right. So basically, you're really only throwing 2 new steps in here. First step, you're boxing your square root. The second step, you're just getting rid of that square root sign by squaring it. So only 2 new things are being thrown at you in this new lesson. All right, let's take a look at example number 2. So example number 2, you have the square root of e plus 14 equals 2. So I went ahead and got it set up for you. I made sure I circled my variable, I drew my line of equality, and I put a box around the square root sign. Now, your goal is to get that square root by itself. If there is nothing else outside of that box, then you know the square root is by itself. So move down to step 2. So take about a minute to see what you can do. What's 2 squared? Oh, okay, you fixed it. You're gonna look at this again. I think you got it for the most part. You got some. I think your writing was a little off, so it made your. How'd you get rid of that square root sign? What did you do to make sure you box it? Okay, so let's go ahead and look at it. So, the first thing you should do every single time you see an equation with a square root, circle your variable, draw your line, and put a box around the square root. That's going to help you when we get into more complicated problems. Now, in this particular example, the square root is by itself. There's nothing outside of that box, so I can move on to step 2. Step 2 says get rid of the square root sign, and you do that by squaring each side of our line of equality. So I'm going to put a square and a square. Now, because square and square root cancel each other out, I'm going to show that that square cancels that square root sign, which means it gets rid of it. So if I get rid of my square root sign on my left side, I can just bring down the e plus 14. Then on my right side, I have to simplify 2 squared. So what's 2 squared simplified? Which is?
4.
Yeah. And then the last step, solve as usual. So I get that variable by itself by so then I can bring down my equals negative 10. That's your final answer. Put that negative in there. And that should be not a 4, but a, there you go. Okay, let's take a look at the next example. Now, we're going to start getting a little more difficult. So again, I'm going to circle my variable. I'm going to draw my line of equality. Then I'm going to put a box around my square root. Now, when I put a box around my square root, what am I going to put the box around here? What am I going to put the box around? Only the square root. So what's my square root in this example? Okay? So I'm only going to put it around the d plus 1, as Isaiah said, because that's the only thing that has the square root sign over it. I do not include that minus 3, and I do not include that equals 6. It's not part of the square root. The box, again, only goes around that square root. I know I'm repeating myself, but that's so important that you remember. Now, step 1 says our goal is to get that square root by itself. Well, in this particular example, is my square root by itself? Is there any other number outside of the square root box?
Yes.
It's by itself? So there's nothing else on this side of the line of equality. Yeah, that negative 3 is not in that box. It's not part of that square root. So I have to get this square root by itself. So I'm going to have to get rid of that negative 3, that minus 3. So yeah, I'm going to add 3. So then on my left side, I'm going to bring down my square root because I haven't gotten rid of the square root sign yet. Then on my right side, I'm going to go ahead and simplify. What's 6 plus 3? That'd be 9. Now,
Wait, what about your square roots?
it's still right here. It's right here.
Don't mean like the little two.
We're gonna be there now. Because you can't do all the steps at the same time. So remember, step 1 says box the square root and then get the box or get the square root by itself by using the golden rule. Well, that's what we just did here. We got the square root by itself because we got rid of that minus 3. So now it's my square root by itself. Is there anything on this side of the equation that's not part of the square root? No. So now I'm ready to move to step 2, which Isaiah said, well, what about that square thing? This is where we square it. We want to get rid of that square root sign. So the inverse operation of square root is square. And remember the golden rule. Whatever I do to one side of the line of equality, I must do to the other. So square and square root cancel. So now I got rid of my square root sign, so I can just bring down the d plus 1. Then on my right side, what's 9 squared?
81.
81. Then you solve as usual.
What you subtract by 1?
You subtract 1. Bring down your d equals 81 minus 1?
80.
80. That's your final answer. So that one's a little bit different. We had to get rid of a number before we could square the square root. Can you check on Deontay? He's in the restroom. All right, let's look at example number 4. Just having them check on you to make sure you're alive. Okay. So now we have the square root of f minus 3 divided by 2 equals 3. So we're going to circle our variable, draw our line of equality, and then I'm going to box only my square root. Now, my goal is to first get that square root by itself. Now, anything on the side of the equality with the square root that is not inside that box, we have to get rid of. Well, what number is not inside that box? What? The 2. So how do I get rid of that 2? Yeah, I multiply by 2. So on my left side, I'm going to bring down the square root of
3.
f minus 3, because I haven't gotten rid of the square root yet, equals, and what's 3 times 2? Okay. Now, is my square root by itself?
No.
Is there anything else
Yep.
on this side? Yeah, so the square root's by itself. Now I'm ready to get rid of the square root sign. I do that how? No.
Like golden rule.
No.
Put the square roots on
No. You're close. You just said the wrong word.
Times 2?
the
The core.
Read step 2. Look at step 2.
square root on both sides of it.
Square both sides of the
Square both sides. So you're going to square both sides because square root and square are inverse operations.
That's what I just said.
I didn't hear you. So you're going to square both sides. So the square and square root cancel, leaving us now with just f minus 3 equals, and then what's 6 squared?
36.
36. And then the final step,
You add 3.
solve as usual. (36 plus 3)
39.
and box it. Bless you. All right, let's take a look at example number 5. Oh, we're going to pause there for a second. All right, so go ahead and get example number 5 down. Remember, only box the square root. So I'm only going to box the square root. What would I put the box around?
G minus 7.
Good. I would make sure I do not put that 3 in there because the 3 is not under the square root sign. Now, my goal here is to get the square root by itself. So what do I have to get rid of? How do I get rid of that 3? Because that 3 is not inside of that box. So how do I get rid of that 3? Okay, so 3 next to a square root sign is kind of like 3 next to a parenthesis, which would mean multiply. The opposite of multiply would be divide. And that's something new we're seeing here.
I thought you was building.
I'm going to divide by 3. Now, on my left side, I bring down the square root of g minus 7. And on my right side, 9 divided by 3.
3.
There's step 1. Now, is my square root by itself? Yes. So how do I get rid of the square root sign?
Put times 2, then you cross out.
It's not times 2.
The square.
Square. You have to square it. Whatever I do to one side, I must do to the other. So I square my other side. Square and square root cancel. And so now I can just bring down my g minus 7
But what about your
equals, and what's 3 squared?
9.
Isaiah, what was your question?
What about the box though?
You can bring it down. You don't necessarily have to for the second step. Some people choose to do, especially when we get into multi-step square root equations. But as long as you start off with it boxed, you're okay. Okay, now we step 3, solve as usual. So how do I get the g by itself?
Plus
So then g equals, and box it. All right, you get it? This is one of my favorite lessons. All right, last example we're going to do today. Wow, look at that one. You're going to follow the exact same steps. It's just going to be a couple more numbers that you're going to have to get rid of. So what am I going to put a box around? Which is, what's under that square root that I make sure I include?
H12.
That's all that goes in that box, right?
No.
So this time, I have 2 numbers I have to get rid of. I'm going to have to determine what number to get rid of first. I need to get rid of the 4 and the minus 5. Because I'm solving for the equation, I'm going to use order of operations backwards. So that's where that SADMAP comes into play. So if I'm doing order of operations backwards, what number, the 4 and the minus 5, would I get rid of first?
5.
Okay, so what's the opposite of minus 5?
Plus 5.
So now on my left side, I had to bring down that 4 square root h minus 12. On my right side, what's 11 plus 5?
16.
Now, is my square root by itself? No, what do I have to get rid of now? How do I do that?
Divide by 4.
There you go. So then on the left side, I bring down my square root because I haven't gotten rid of that square root sign yet, h minus 12. Now on my right side, 16 divided by 4.
4.
Okay, I'll give you a second to get this down. Now, is my square root by itself? Yeah, so now I must get rid of the square root sign. How do I get rid of the square root sign?
You put square.
You square each side. So my square and square root cancel. So now I'm able to bring down the h minus 12. And then on my right side, what's 4 squared?
16.
And then solve as usual. plus 12. Cancels. So h equals
20.
close.
28.
28. Good, Devontae.
What you mean? Oh.
6 plus 2? 1 plus 1, which I can't make fun of you because I messed up on the opener today. Alright, so this is solving equations with square roots.